Good evening, Chag Hanukkah Sameach. That's Moshe Storch singing Adama V'Shamaya. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. How are you doing as we get into this second half of Hanukkah with the fifth night? That means that there's more candles on the menorah illuminated, more spots on the menorah illuminated than not illuminated. We're in that second half, and the Berditchever Rabbi teaches this is a time to pray for abundance in our lives, that we should have more than expected, particularly in the areas of light and illumination, that we should see things clearly. We should pray that God's presence will be more revealed in the world. I mean, it'll be fully revealed when Mashiach comes, but in the meantime, that God's presence should be more revealed to us. Who is with us on this fine fifth night of Hanukkah? Yehudit Sobel is first in South Carolina. Stephen in New Hampshire. Melissa in Great Neck. Renee says Indy's in the house. Paula in Chicago. James in Indianapolis. Sharon in New Jersey. Pauline in Arkansas. Tom in Pennsylvania. Nancy in North Carolina. Lucy in Minnesota. Chaim is with us saying good evening. Tamara with us in Wisconsin. Ann in Merced, California. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Carol in Cleveland. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Debbie in Toms River, New Jersey. Marjorie in Tucker, Georgia. And Cheryl says hi. Welcome, everybody. It's really good to be with you. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is dedicated. We've got a couple. First, I'll go with Linda Miller. Beautiful dedication. We were really moved by this. Linda dedicating tonight's episode of AT Daily in gratitude of her spiritual reawakening through our lessons here at AT Daily. I was just so moved by that, and it's wonderful to hear that this class is really meaningful in people's lives. We thank you, Linda, for that dedication, and you should be blessed to only grow in wisdom every day and to transmit what you learn to the people around you, the people that you care about. You are a blessing to us, and you should be a blessing to them, and they should be a blessing to you. And we say amen. Also, tonight's episode is dedicated by Gail Har in memory of her mother, Bernice Rothschild, who passed away on Friday, December 11th at the age of 98. Baruch Dayan Emes. What a beautiful long life Bernice had, and what a beautiful dedication from you, Gail. May Bernice's memory always be for a blessing, and may the merit of the learning that we do here today in her name, in her honor, carry her even just a little higher in the world of souls, in the world of truth, where she is now. May her neshama, her soul, have a great elevation to the highest levels of heaven, and may you be blessed for dedicating this episode in her memory. We say amen. Okay. We are holding on Pesachim Chaf Gimel. So Pesachim, the fourth volume, fourth tractate of the Talmud. These are the laws. Oh, let me shut that off. These are the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 2, discussing the first Mishna here on page 23. But actually, before we talk about what we're learning on today's daf, I actually want to say something about Hanukkah. We covered this quite a bit earlier in our journey this year, right? So it's interesting that there's no separate tractate of the Talmud dedicated to Hanukkah, but Hanukkah is mentioned in Tractate Shabbos, and we encountered a teaching about Hanukkah back on page 21b of Tractate Shabbos, where we learned that the sages taught in a Baraisa. The basic mitzvah of Hanukkah is each day to have a light kindled by one person, the head of the household, for himself and on behalf of his household. So all you really need to do to fulfill the obligation of Hanukkah is to light one candle each day of Hanukkah on behalf of yourself and the whole household. And the mehadrin, okay, meaning the meticulous ones, and the mehadrin, those who are meticulous in the performance of mitzvahs, kindle a light for each and every person in the household, right? So the ones who are really meticulous about fulfilling the mitzvah, they light one candle for themselves and one candle for each member of the household. And the mehadrin min mehadrin, the most meticulous, the meticulous of the meticulous. In other words, the most exacting in the piety of their observance of the mitzvah, the commandment of Hanukkah, they do more. And there's a disagreement on how to do more between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So the followers of Shammai say, on the first day, one kindles 8 lights, and from there on, gradually decreases the number of lights until on the last day of Hanukkah, he kindles 1 light. And Beis Hillel say, the followers of Hillel, on the first day, one kindles 1 light, and from there on, gradually increases the number of lights until, on the last day, he kindles 8 lights. So, the most exacting, the most observant, the most religious, if you will, of the Jews, the mehadrin, min mehadrin, are the ones who increase or decrease the number of lights each day, right? Obviously, that sounds familiar to us because that's the practice that we have now. Now, do we start with 8 lights and decrease each night, or start with 1 light and increase each night? Obviously, we increase each night. So we all who observe Hanukkah by lighting a menorah and increasing the number of candles each light are actually right there in that camp with the most meticulous of Jews and of the Jewish people in our observance of Hanukkah. And why do we increase the number of lights each night and not decrease? Beis Shammai say we decrease. It actually makes a lot of logical sense. What was the miracle of the lights of Hanukkah? That after this small band of rebels against the Greek Empire managed to defeat the mightiest army on earth and establish our independence, and then go back into the temple, which had been defiled by the Greek forces, and were only able to find 1 cruse of oil, whose seal from the high priest was intact, enough to light the menorah of the candelabra of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem for 1 day. And yet the miracle was that the oil, which was clearly only enough for 1 day, lasted for 8 days, the amount of time that was required to get some, new oil certified pure, as it were, in a state of tahara, as we've discussed before. But that cruise that lasted for 8, that should have lasted for 1 day and lasted instead for 8, okay, well, some of it was being used up because at the end of 8 days, it was done. So it would make sense, like Beis Shammai, to say, well, we start with 8 candles, and each day a little bit was used up, but we still have enough to last for the 8 nights. Beis Hillel say we increase the number of lights each night, and the halacha, generally speaking, certainly the custom, the minhag, is to follow Beis Hillel in this. And why do we all follow Beis Hillel? This is according to the statement of, who was it? Beis Hillel, and one said that the reason was, so this is according to Rabbi Yosef Bar Zavida, and what he said was that in matters of holiness, we don't degrade, we upgrade, right? We don't downgrade, we upgrade, right? So in matters of holiness, in matters of sanctity, we don't want to see that there's going to be less light each night. We want there to be more light each night. And so this general principle in the Talmud that in matters of sanctity, we go up, we elevate, we don't go down, we don't diminish or degrade or downgrade. And that's why we increase the number of candles every night. And all of us who do that are being absolutely punctilious in the observance of Hanukkah. The mehadrin mean mehadrin. Now, it's always valuable to learn that during Hanukkah, and this is the first time in this cycle that we're together and learning, and that it's Hanukkah. We started on January 5th, so soon we're going to have the one-year anniversary of this class. But I also wanted to mention it tonight because I heard this wonderful story, thanks to the organization J Roots, about a family. So the patriarch of the family was, I think, about 10 years old during the Holocaust, a German Jewish family, and he survived. And I'm not sure if his mother survived or not, but at least she survived part of the time for sure. And when they were in the midst of the Holocaust and, doing whatever they could to survive and suffering and, the untold suffering of the Jews, 6 million were murdered. Many millions survived, but it was not easy, right? It was a time of absolute, deprivation and suffering. My mother and my grandmother survived the Holocaust. My grandfather was murdered in it. My grandmother's memories of it are dark indeed. My mother was just an infant, but my grandmother, she left this world in 1997, but we heard some of the stories. I mean, it's just a terrible time. At any rate, this fellow, the German Jew who ended up living in the United States, I don't know, some time ago, maybe, I don't know if it was last year or a few years ago, there was actually an emergency in the man's home. His wife had to go to the hospital, and an EMT came from the Hatzolah organization, beautiful organization, does amazing work providing EMT services in Jewish neighborhoods. They're active in New York and LA and I don't know how many other cities. But it was an observant Jew who came to provide these EMT services for the wife, and they were going to take her to the hospital. But, I mean, she was conscious, but she needed to go to the hospital. And the husband said, wait 1 minute. Before we leave, I just want to light the menorah so that she can at least see the lights of Hanukkah before she goes to the hospital. And the EMT observed that actually before he lit the menorah, and it was a menorah using oil lamps, very beautiful menorah, but first he lit a wick in oil in a little scooped out area of a potato. And actually, this is what it looked like. Let me see if this is clear enough. Yeah, this is what it looked like, right? So it was a potato with a little hollowed out area, oil in it, and then a wick and a wick holder placed in that. And the gentleman and his family had been lighting a wick in a potato, in oil, in a scooped out potato, and with some oil inside for 75 years since the Holocaust. It had become a family tradition. Why? Because during the Holocaust, they couldn't find candles and they couldn't light a menorah. He didn't even describe in this video what the exact circumstances were of surviving the Holocaust, except suffice it to say that they felt blessed that they could get a potato and a little bit of oil and some kind of material like a piece of cloth torn from a shirt or something to act as a wick and light that one candle. And as we saw, a person fulfills the mitzvah of Hanukkah with just one candle. You don't have to have a menorah if all you've got is one candle. The key is you can't use that light for anything other than to celebrate Hanukkah. You should stare at the light. You should remember the miracles and wonders that God performed for our people in those days, at this time, and throughout history, when oppressors tried to wipe us out and God saved us. That's what to remember and to think about as you stare into the Hanukkah lights. But for example, you can't read by them. You can't make use of the lights the way you can with a Shabbos light, right? Shabbos, we light the lights before Shabbos begins so that we'll have light in the house. These days, okay, we can have electric lights on timers, but in ancient times, we lit the Shabbos lights, so we would have light in the house. The Hanukkah lights are not to light up our house. It's to publicize the nes, the miracle that the Holy One performed for us in those days at that time. And I just wanted to share this story of the potato menorah, right? It's beautiful to have lots of menorahs and lots of candles and, big ones and silver ones and nice homemade ones that the kids made and all those different things. But really all you must have is one light. And perhaps that potato menorah that this family, and I think they're in New Jersey, that they still light every year, and God willing will, until Mashiach comes and beyond, they should be blessed that the beauty of the commitment of the mother and son during the Holocaust to find a way to observe Hanukkah in the darkest of times, that family truly lit up the darkness. Okay, let's get back to our daf today. By the way, if you're interested in dedicating an episode to the honor or to the memory or to the healing of a loved one, this is a great time to do it. We're in our annual campaign. Nina will put that link in the comments there, but it's simple to remember. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. We're about halfway through the campaign here. It's a December, year-ending annual campaign. And we're coming right up on that halfway mark of our goal. And it would be wonderful, if maybe people from the class help us get over the hump, over that halfway point of the annual campaign. Okay, let's get back to our daf. This Mishna that we're discussing, the first Mishna of chapter 2 here in Tractate Pesachim, has to do with the difference between something that's permitted to eat and what's permitted for benefit. The Mishnah said that as long as the chametz, the leavened bread, is permitted to be eaten by some Jew, it could also be fed to the animals. Meaning, as long as it was permitted for some Jew to eat it, most people couldn't, but the teruma of the priest, the consecrated food of the priest, is allowed to be eaten by the priest for 1 more hour than the chametz in the possession of all the other Jews. And so long as the priests could eat their chametz of teruma, their consecrated food, that's why they get the extra hour, because it's consecrated food. We want to give them every opportunity to consume it rather than to have to destroy it, since it's leaven and we can't have leaven in our possession during Passover. But as long as the priests were permitted to eat it, all people were permitted to benefit from their chametz, from their leaven, even though they could no longer eat it. How could they benefit from it? By feeding it to their animals or by selling it to a non-Jew, etc. That's the Mishnah that we have been discussing. And then we went into the area that we're currently in has been a discussion about this minor dispute or minor disagreement between Chizkiya and Rabbi Obahu. And what they said is, according to Chizkiya, how do we know that we're not allowed to benefit? According to Chizkiya, when the Torah says that a particular thing, like chametz, shall not be eaten, that comes to imply that not only can it not be eaten, but it cannot be. We cannot take benefit from it either, because it's worded in that tense. Not one shall not eat chametz, but rather chametz shall not be eaten. Means that not only can we not eat it, but in any way that it might be used and then lead to eating, right? So if we sell it, for example, we're not going to eat it, but we're going to get money, and any money that's added to our bank account, some of that money is eventually going to get used for our eating, right? We all eat, we all spend money on eating in our lives. And so if we have some kind of financial gain, it contributes to our eating. So according to Chizkiya, that's how we know that we can't benefit from the chametz at the same time that we can't eat it. And Obahu would say you don't even need that grammatical principle, that anytime the Torah says we may not eat something, it is prohibited for benefit, no matter what the syntax is. And and that was his sense of it. And then we've been looking for, okay, well, that's their disagreement, but the general principle is basically the same. If it's prohibited for eating, it's going to be prohibited for benefit unless the Torah specifies otherwise. And we learned that from the case of the nevela, the carcass of a kosher animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher fashion. A Jew cannot eat it, but he may gift it to a Noahide, and he may sell it to a nazir, right? So somebody who practices a different religion. Okay, so where am I? Okay, so on this page today, we're going to finally sort of come to the end of this discussion where the Gemara has been presenting challenges to this principle. Is it so that anytime the Torah prohibits us to eat something, it's also going to prohibit it for benefit, unless the Torah specifically permits that thing for benefit, that it prohibited for eating? Is that so? And so the Gemara has been bringing a series of challenges. We're going to have a few more before we get to the resolution of this debate. So at Leviticus 22:10, we learn that no one shall eat teruma unless he's a priest, right? No Israelite, no non-priest, no Jew who's not a priest. And remember, a priest in Judaism is a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother. It's a hereditary thing. You can't become a Kohen if you weren't born one. Not all Kohanim are going to serve in the temple. You know, when the third temple is rebuilt, not all Kohanim, not all born priests served in the temple at the time that the temple was standing 2,000 years ago. But only one who's born a priest is going to have that opportunity. And also for priests, whether they serve in the temple or not, only a priest, one who's born a priest, can eat of teruma. So this is food. The first tithe, the first 2% of all our produce, goes to the priests as consecrated food for them, for their benefit. Only they can eat it. At Leviticus 22:10, we learn that no one else shall eat of the teruma, the consecrated food that is set aside for the priest. So that would seem to indicate, according to this principle, that we can't eat it and we can't benefit from the teruma that's set aside from the priest. Only the priest can eat it, and presumably only the priest can benefit from it. Nonetheless, we learned in a Mishna, and we learned it in Tractate Erev, the last tractate we were studying, that we can establish an Erev on behalf of a person. Recall that to establish an Erev, there's different kinds of Erevin, whether you're joining courtyards for some individuals or you're going to change somebody's dwelling place so that they can walk further in one direction, observing the 2,000 cubit limit on walking on Shabbos. You can only go 2,000 cubits from your dwelling if you live in a town or city, from the edges of that city. But if you want to go, 3,000 cubits in that direction, walking on Shabbos, what you can do is before Shabbos begins, deposit 2 meals worth of food in a safe place. Let's say, 1,000 cubits in that direction. That's going to be considered my dwelling for Shabbos. And then on Saturday, when I want to go walking, 3,000 cubits away to have lunch with my friend, the first 1,000 cubits, I'm not actually walking away from my house. I'm walking toward my dwelling that I established by depositing those 2 meals worth of food in a safe place. And then the 2,000 cubits more to get to my friend's house is going to be permitted because I changed the domicile I changed my dwelling place by depositing that food. That's an Erev Techumen, a joining of the boundaries. Now, that food that goes in that Erev, we learned that you actually can use teruma, consecrated food that only a priest could eat, to establish an Erev for a non-priest, right? A regular Jew, an Israelite, can have his Erev established for him using teruma. So he definitely is getting a benefit from that food, even though he's not allowed to eat that food. Only a priest can eat that food, yet this non-priest can get benefit of teruma that's being used in that basket of food, located in the safe spot to be his domicile. So that would seem to contradict this principle that if we're not allowed to eat it, we can't benefit from it unless the Torah specifies otherwise. Well, Rav Papa says the Torah does specify otherwise. In the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 27, it says, "And your teruma shall be reckoned unto you as though it were grain of the threshing floor." So the teruma that we are setting aside, this tithe that we're setting aside to benefit the priests, it's called our teruma, right? Like let's say we're talking about you, right? So this teruma that you would set aside, you're living in Israel, you're setting while the temple is standing, and you're setting aside the first 2% of your produce to give to the priest, right? It's not called the priest's teruma. Only the priest can eat it. You're going to give it to the priest, but it's still called your teruma. And from that, Rav Papa learns out, because the Torah called it your teruma, using this possessive form of you, that you own the teruma. And what that means is you can't eat it, but you can benefit from it. Now, right away, we have a contradiction with another lesson we learned elsewhere, that, for example, if we're talking about teruma of olive oil, so again, you have to give the first, you are a olive farmer and you produce olive oil on your property. And so of that olive oil that gets made, the first 2% needs to go to a priest so we can have teruma of olive oil. Now, you can't eat it. You also cannot anoint yourself with it. You can't use that olive oil to rub on your dry skin. That the Torah said you can't eat it, but this comes to include anointing oneself with it also. So that would seem to indicate, well, wait a minute, we can't benefit from it. And Rav Steinsaltz, in the name of the Meiri, who was a 13th century commentator in Spain, says that the distinction is we're not allowed to benefit from the oil in a way that would diminish the amount of it, right? So we can't eat it clearly, and we can't anoint ourselves with it because we would be using it up. But if we deposit it in the Erev, which we're not going to eat or anoint from, we get the benefit of having that oil in that location, so that we change our Shabbos dwelling so that we can walk in the direction we want to the amount of distance we need to walk. So we benefit from it, but we're not going to diminish it. So the benefit that is permitted for teruma is a benefit that does not diminish the amount of teruma while we benefit from it. So using it in an Erev is one form of benefit that doesn't diminish the principle. And another form, very interesting, is called the benefit of discretion. This is not what it sounds like. Although there certainly is a benefit to being a discreet person who keeps their mouth shut who doesn't yak when they shouldn't be yakking, and keeps information on a need-to-know basis, as it were. There's certainly benefits to that. But when we talk about the benefit of discretion in Talmudic parlance, what we're saying is that a person who's going to, who has set aside a tithe of teruma for the priests, and then the next tithe is the miser, the actual tithe, the 1/10 of his produce, that has to be given to the Levite. But which Levite and which priest? Well, a person who's setting those tithes apart, the teruma for the priest and the miser for the Levite, can choose which priest and which Levite they would like to give it to. It's not like the tax collector comes to their house. They need to go out and find a priest or a Levite to give those consecrated amounts to. And so that's called the benefit of discretion, the fact that you can choose who you want to give this tithe to. And that's generally a good thing to understand, that when we give a gift, right? I mean, the Torah says we have to give it, but nevertheless, the priest who receives it or the Levite who receives it, is acknowledging that it's a beneficence, right? It's a gift to him from us, ordained by the Torah, but it's not like they paid for it, right? They just get it from us. In the sense they do pay for it, in the sense that the priest has obligations under the Torah, and so does the Levite, and the Levite was not entitled to receive land in the original apportioning of the land of the Holy Land of Israel. Nevertheless, there is a benefit to giving people a gift. There's a benefit to the giver, right? Obviously, there's a benefit to the recipient, but there is a benefit to the giver, the goodwill that one earns from the recipient, as well as other spiritual benefits. Whenever we give to others, there is definitely, according to the sages, a benefit to ourselves, one well worth remembering. Okay. All right. Chizkiya said that. Wait a minute. Now, so now Chizkiya said that this phrasing of "one shall not eat," right? So now this passage in the Torah has said the Israelites shall not eat the Teruma, the consecrated food set aside from the priest. According to Chizkiya, since it's worded as "one shall not eat," that already only prohibits eating and does permit benefit. According to Chizkiya, it's only when the verse is said, if it said Teruma shall not be eaten by an Israelite, that would include the prohibition on benefit as well as eating. But according to Chizkiya, when it's in that active form, the Israelite shall not eat, he would be permitted for benefit, according to Chizkiya. So what does he do with this phrase, your Teruma, which Rav Papa said that's why we're permitted to benefit from it. According to Chizkiya, we're already permitted to benefit from it. What does he do with this phrase elsewhere in the Torah? It's your Teruma. It shall be reckoned for you, like the grain of the threshing floor. And Chizkiya would say, you don't have to learn anything from it, because when it says your Teruma, it doesn't necessarily mean the one who set that Teruma aside for the priest. It might just mean the general Teruma of the Jewish people. It's just the vernacular. And this kind of disagreement will come up often with the sages. One sage will say, we can learn something from that phrase. There's a deeper meaning that has a halachic, a legal significance. And another sage will say, that's just the vernacular of Hebrew, the vernacular of the Torah, and it's not available to learn a lesson from. Another challenge, it says that a nazir, so a nazir is someone who takes the vow of naziris, that he will not benefit from the grapevine in any way. Usually, the famous nazir was Samson, right? The Samson and Delilah story in the Bible. Samson was one who never, all his life, he never touched anything of the grape. And while you're a nazir, you can't cut your hair either. And somehow for Samson, that also translated into superhuman strength. But the basic thing about a nazir is he doesn't cut his hair and he doesn't benefit in any way. He doesn't eat anything that comes from a grapevine. He doesn't have wine. He doesn't have grape juice. He doesn't eat table grapes. He doesn't eat grape skins. He doesn't have raisins, nothing. That's not necessary. Usually that's not for one's whole life or indefinite. Usually one who takes a vow of naziris does it for a finite amount of time. The sort of default amount of time is 30 days. But one can specify when one is doing that. The sages actually look down on the vow of naziris. They think that people should not take a vow to abstain from anything that God gave us to use. There's no reason to take on that sort of higher level of piety. Nonetheless, the Torah provides for it. So if a person wants to do that, of course, he can. It is certainly not prohibited. It is permitted. It's just not regarded as the best thing to do, because why abstain from something that God gave us to enjoy? Nevertheless, the Torah says that if one does take the vow of naziris, that person shall not eat anything which is the product of the grapevine. And yet we just saw that... I don't know if I mentioned it before, but in terms of an Erev, not only can we make an Erev for an Israel, a non-priest with Teruma that could only be eaten by a priest, but also we could establish an Erev for a Nazir with a bottle of wine, right? So we can use wine to establish an Erev for a person who is not allowed to drink the wine, and it is a valid eruv, and he can rely on it on Shabbos and walk accordingly or carry accordingly, depending on the kind of eruv that it is. And Mar Zutra, and so that would seem to say, well, wait a minute, so then we have a case where the Torah said he's not allowed to drink the wine, and yet apparently he can benefit from a grape product. He can benefit from this wine in the sense of the eruv. And Mar Zutra says, no, but the Torah did specify that a person who cannot, that a nazir who cannot eat or drink any product of the grapevine, nevertheless can benefit from it. How does the Torah specify that? Because it says that when the law describes that he shall be a nazir and that all the days of his nazirus, he will not eat of the grapevine and he will not cut his hair, etc. But it says all the days of his nazirus. Again, this possessive form, which is to teach you that the nazirus is something that is for him. He abstains according to his vow, but that doesn't mean he can't benefit from things that are related to his vow. And that possessive form teaches that, yes, he's allowed, he can't drink wine, but for example, he doesn't have to sell all his wine. It's not like we're not allowed to have chametz in our possession during Passover and we have to get rid of it. A nazir, during his nazirus, can't drink the wine, but he can still have a wine cellar. He can still own bottles of wine and benefit from them. Likewise, he can use wine in an eruv. He can benefit from it. He just can't drink it or eat any grape product. Another challenge, the new grain, meaning the harvested grain, the early harvest, the spring harvest of grain. The Torah says we cannot eat any of the New Year's grain until the omer offering is brought. That happens on the second day of Passover. The omer is brought to the temple when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. Prior to that offering, the grain offering being brought, the omer, we cannot eat grain of that year's harvest. We can only eat grain products from the previous year's harvest. So there's another prohibition. This is something that you cannot eat. Nevertheless, we've learned that even though we cannot eat that grain, we can feed it to our animals. In fact, the early ripening grain in Israel is the barley, which actually is more feed for animals than people, right? It's not that barley products are considered, the finest type of food for humans. Over the course of counting the omer, the 50 days between the second day of Passover and Shavuos, then we eventually come to the 2 loaves that are offered on Shavuos, and it's like we progress from barley, which is animal food, to wheat bread, which is human food, and there's this sense of refining our personalities and our character traits during those 50 days that we count when we're counting the omer from Passover to Shavuos. At any rate, once again, Torah prohibits us to eat that new grain, but we've learned that we are allowed to feed it to our animals. Therefore, we are allowed to benefit from it. Does the Torah specify that we can benefit of this new grain that we're not allowed to eat? Yes, again, in the same way, the Torah refers to your harvest. You cannot eat the product of your harvest, but it remains your harvest that you can feed to the animals. Another example was creeping things, which may not be eaten. So there's a whole list of animals that a Jew is not permitted to eat. They're not kosher for us to eat. In terms of creeping, swarming things, the Torah goes even farther and says that these will be an abomination to you. Jews are just not permitted to eat all these foods. And yet we also have a teaching that if a Jewish trapper, right, there's no Jewish hunter. Maybe he's hunting for sport, but a Jew can't hunt food, like kill the food, kill mammon. He can go fishing. But he can't kill a kosher animal with a gun or a bow and arrow or even a knife unless, he shechts it properly. He does a kosher slaughter. Otherwise, it cannot be eaten. But a Jew could be a trapper, right? So he could trap the animal as long as he doesn't harm it so that it becomes what's called a treifa, as long as it doesn't become harmed in the trapping process, then later it can be done a kosher slaughter. Well, what if a Jewish trapper happens accidentally to trap a non-kosher animal in his traps? What can he do with it? It is permitted to sell it to a non-Jew. So now he's prohibited to eat that non-kosher animal, but he is permitted to benefit from it. And again, it's going to say, that these things are an abomination to you, right? They're an abomination for you, meaning it's an abomination for you to eat them, but they're still for you, right? And the sages will learn out from that this incidentally trapped non-kosher animal can be sold, can be given or can be sold to the non-Jew. So we get that benefit from it, even though we can't eat it. Interestingly, the sages will also learn out that while you can do that, a Jewish trapper with an incidentally caught non-kosher animal can give it away. But, say the sages, by rabbinic decree, a Jew cannot ab initio be trapping non-kosher animals, right? You can't make a business out of trapping non-kosher animals. You can't go after non-kosher animals. You're not going to find a religious Jewish pig farmer. It is prohibited. And then the question is asked, well, wait a minute, why? If the Torah permits, if the Torah specifies, we've just said that in terms of benefit, we're not anything that we're not allowed to eat, we're not going to be allowed to benefit from unless the Torah specifically says you can benefit from it. So now we've learned that the Torah specifically says you can benefit from these non-kosher animals. So why the sage is going to come along and say that a Jew cannot benefit from these animals in the sense of being in the trapping business or in the buying and selling business of non-kosher animals? And the answer is because the Torah also says that these shall be an abomination for you. Not they are an abomination, but they shall be an abomination for you. And that means that they're going to remain an abomination for you. You can't eat it, and it's going to remain sort of, abominable for you. And the sages learned from that, okay, incidentally caught in our trap, no problem. We didn't want that to happen. God put the non-kosher animal there so we can sell it and get that benefit. But to make a profession out of trapping or trading in non-kosher animals, that is not permitted to a Jew. More cases follow. I'm almost at the end here, so if you have questions and comments, please put them in there now. There's going to be more cases like this, challenges from the Torah where it seems like we're prohibited to eat something, and yet we are permitted to benefit from it. That seems to violate the principle. But in every case, one of the sages is able to show it, but the Torah does specify that benefit is available, so the principle remains intact. And at the end of the day, what is the difference between Chizkiya, who says that generally speaking, if it says you can't eat it, we can benefit from it, and we only can't benefit from it if that other syntax is used, that it shall not be eaten, as opposed to one shall not eat it. What's the difference between Chizkiya and Rabbi Obahu, who says that, if it says you can't eat, period, you can't benefit? Both of them agree, but if the Torah specifies that you can benefit, then you can benefit. So what's really the difference between them? It just seems that they get the source of their law, the source of the principle for them comes from a different verse in the Torah. But our daf here asks, so practically speaking, what is the difference between the principle espoused by Chizkiya and that espoused by Rabbi Obahu? And at the end of the day, the only difference between them concerns a non-sacred animal that is slaughtered in the temple. Non-sacred animals cannot be slaughtered in the temple, so this is a very rare occurrence indeed. Normally, the only animals that are slaughtered in the temple courtyard are the ones that are consecrated to be offered up on the altar, to be given to the priest, etc. The Pesach offering, which we're going to eat at Passover, those are all consecrated offerings. Why would a non-sacred animal, a non-consecrated animal, be slaughtered in the temple courtyard? Because a mistake was made. basically because a mistake was made. But even though that animal is not sacred, therefore anybody can eat it, if it was slaughtered in the temple courtyard, says Chizkiya, that is going to be prohibited for benefit according to Torah law. Says Rabbi Obahu, if a non-sacred animal, a non-consecrated animal, somehow is slaughtered in the temple courtyard, it cannot be eaten and we cannot benefit from it. But the reason that we can't benefit from it is not a Torah law, but rather a rabbinic decree. So in the end, there's so little daylight between Chizkiya and Abahu that even though he spent all these pages trying to understand what is between them and identifying the source of their law and challenging this law with all these various exceptions, at the end of the day, they really hold the same thing, but in just one particular case, again, they come to the same ruling, but Chizkiya says it's a Torah law, and Rabbi Obahu says it is by rabbinic decree. I had a question earlier today from one of our really beloved listeners who's been with us for a long time, James in Indianapolis, who said, well, it seems like, we have a commandment in the Torah where God said through his prophet Moses, these are my laws and statutes, you shall not add to them, you shall not subtract from them. But on this subject of you shall not add, isn't that violated by all these, hundreds or thousands of rabbinic decrees? Aren't they adding all kinds of laws on top of what's in the Torah? And the answer is they're not adding to the Torah. Anytime that the rabbis issue a decree, they're issuing it, first of all, for the purpose of protecting us from coming to violate a law of the Torah. So that's the fence around the Torah that the sages were instructed to create a fence around the Torah. They were commanded to do. But it's really just to protect us from coming to transgress laws in the Torah. And secondly, as we've seen and as we just saw, the sages are going to be very careful. They're not going to say, oh, well, it's no big deal. It's just a difference between whether it's a Torah law or a rabbinic decree. They're going to be meticulous. Mehadrin min mehadrin. To establish whether a particular obligation or prohibition was created in the Torah itself or was a rabbinic decree. And it's a huge distinction. First of all, the penalties for violating a Torah law are definitely different than for violating a rabbinic decree. But even if the penalty is not the issue, they are going to always define and distinguish this is written in the Torah. This is a rabbinic decree. There are laws which are Torah laws that are not specifically spelled out in the Torah, that the rabbis kind of tease out. It's like the Torah said it, but it just wasn't fully clear about it. Or something could be a halacha lemoshe misinai, meaning a halacha, a law that was given to Moses orally at Mount Sinai. And so the classic example of that is tefillin, right? The Torah says that you shall, these words, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your resources, etc. And these words, you will bind them as a sign upon your hand and be a symbol before your eyes. That's what the Torah says. How do you fulfill that obligation? Turns out that's tefillin, the black box that you tie on your arm and wrap around your arm, and the other box that goes over your head and rests on your forehead at your hairline. That's how we fulfill that obligation. What is tefillin was shown to Moses at Sinai, and that tradition has been passed down ever since. So that is not a rabbinic decree. That is a Torah law, but it's not one that was added to the Torah. It was given, and we understand that the Torah was given as a written Torah and an oral Torah. The kind of core laws of the oral Torah were given at Mount Sinai, along with the procedure for interpreting the Torah, teasing out laws that aren't so clear that are in the Torah itself, and also how decrees from the rabbis will be added in every generation, which has its basis in the Torah, that you shall listen to your elders in every generation. So that's the role that the sages fulfill, is that you shall listen to the laws and decrees of the sages in your generation. not because they're adding to the Torah, but because they're helping protect us from coming to violate the Torah. Okay, let's go to questions and comments. Tom, what did priests do if they didn't serve in the temple? Well, even the priests that did serve in the temple would only serve a week at a time. So as I recall, and we'll come to this later in our journey through the Talmud, there were, there's a word for it that I can't remember right now, but they were sort of like shifts. They were the shifts of the priests. And so there would be like a whole new shift of priests that would come in each week. And so this group of priests, and usually they were kind of related by family. They're all descendants of Aaron, but, over the generations and the thousands of years, there's like many branches on that family tree. And so a particular family and their friends, however they had come to be grouped, would go in and do a shift. I forget which day they made the changeover. I don't know if it was after Shabbos or before Shabbos. And then they would serve for a week in the temple. And I think they would do that twice a year. I think there were 24 of these shifts, or something like that. And they would serve for a week, and then they would go back to their lives, right? So they weren't full-time priests. Even the ones who did serve in the temple would only serve for a week at a time, and then they would go back to their lives and do whatever they were doing. Now, the priests are Levites, right? Aaron was a Levite. Moshe and Aaron were Levites. So like the rest of the Levites, they weren't given farms, right? They weren't given land in the apportioning of the land at the time that Joshua led the children of Israel into the Holy Land. Where did the Levites go? Into the cities, right? So there were Levitical cities, as it were, some of which became cities of refuge, where the one who killed somebody by accident could flee so that they wouldn't be killed by the avenger of blood, the blood feuds of the ancient world. But the Levites were city people, right? So I'm a Levite, and because they were city people, they got involved in city business, and they actually did well. I mean, they had a somewhat of a stream of income from the tithes of the rest of the people, the farmers, but they also got involved in trade. But because they also had this flow of income from the tithing process, they had more time to set aside for Torah study. And really the priests were entrusted, the early sages were the priests, right? I mean, there were always people who were more involved in Torah study than others, but the priests had to be Torah scholars so that they could fulfill their obligations well. And the Levites were serving the priests, so they also had to be Torah scholars and be able to fulfill their duties. And there were always Levites serving in the temple as well. They weren't doing the avoda of the sacrifices. But if you ever went to the temple, there were Levites kind of in the subordinate positions. The priests had the high-level duties, and the Levites did everything else. And the Levites were also musicians. So there was a choir that was always singing and playing instruments in the temple. We discussed that a little bit towards the end of Tractate Eruvin, that there were Levites playing harps and trumpets and drums and other instruments. And they could even play those on Shabbos. We can't play musical instruments on Shabbos, but in the temple, they could. Who? The Levites, right? So the Levites were serving in the temple. Again, there were many more Levites than priests. They weren't serving there all the time, but it was an honor and a privilege to spend, 1 week or 2 weeks a year doing that. Sharon, I had been told that I cannot feed my dogs and cats chametz during Pesach because I would derive pleasure from feeding them. Is that the way one derives benefit from animals not raised for profit like a farm animal? Well, I mean, that's interesting, Sharon. I don't know that you even need that, though, because, you can't possess chametz, right? It could be found on your property if it belonged to somebody else, specifically a non-Jew, right? That's what we sell our chametz to non-Jews. But then it has to remain isolated during all of Passover, and we cannot benefit from chametz, not from our chametz. So, it might not be a farm animal, but, it's your property. That dog is your property, and feeding it, costs money. And so if you fed it chametz, you would be benefiting from that, even aside from the pleasure. Maybe there's another principle involved here that I'm not aware of or that I'm not thinking of. That could certainly be the case. But it seems to me that feeding your dog chametz would be a benefit to you, and that's why that would be prohibited during Pesach. Tom, didn't Samson's mother take the Nazirite vow for her son? Yes, she did. And that would be a great question. Like, can we take a vow on behalf of someone else? Can we enjoin them, to abstain from something that they didn't agree to? It would seem like that would be a no. On the other hand, you can do that for a minor. A parent can do for a child, right? A parent, I don't know what the limits of that are, but while a minor is living in our house and eating our food and subject to our authority, then there's a lot of things that we can bind the minor to. And I have in parentheses here, yes, she had trouble conceiving, and an angel appeared to her and said she would have a son. And must make him a Nazirite. So she was commanded to do that. I don't have that tip of my tongue. I'd have to look up that passage. But assuming that that's true, so it wasn't even that she bound him, it was the angel bound him. Okay, so, God had plans for Samson, and it was a great story in the Bible because of it. And from Neil, does tithing still occur during Passover holiday? And if so, I guess the tithe must be non-chametz. So here you're asking a really interesting question, right? So if you're a farmer and you happen to be growing grain and you farm it during Passover, aren't you now pulling chametz into your possession? And then you would need to tithe that and get that benefit. I mean, that's a whole other set of problems. I'm not sure how that's handled. Some people don't work on the intermediate days. It is certainly permitted. It's not like Shabbos and Yom Tov to work on the intermediate days. But if your work is connected to chametz, I suspect that you would have to refrain from doing that work during the holiday, and that way you wouldn't get involved with the chametz. It's a good question, though, and maybe we'll run into that later in our journey through Masechet Pesachim. That sounds like a question that might well come up in this first part, right? Remember that this tractate is divided into two basic parts. The first half is going to be more about chametz and matzah and the festival of matzah, and the second half is going to be, I think, a little bit more about the Paschal offering itself, how we bring it, how we set it aside, how it gets cooked, how it gets slaughtered, etc. But that'll be later in our journey. All right, that's what I've got for us this evening. You should all be blessed to have a beautiful and illuminating fifth night of Hanukkah. This is a great time to pray for increased revelation, increased clarity, increased knowledge, increased wisdom in your life and in the lives of people you care about. Have a great night.